Hello, my name's Mark Avis. In this essay, I'll first examine the situational context in which wokeism has arisen, and having done this, I'll compare the Marxist adaptation of wokeism with prior adaptations of Marxism, and show that wokeism is currently a strange mix of some of the evilest ideologies of the last century. Before I continue, there's something I do need to get out of the way. I saw some time ago a case of a history video being banned from YouTube, as it included discussion of a 20th century political party. The video in question was simply a historical account. The problem was with the discussion of the political party that emerged in Germany in the 1920s, and the mention of the party name and the leader's name were what caused the ban. As such, I'll not use their names. For the political party, I'll call them the Nasty Party, and for the leader, I'll call him Voldemort on the basis he cannot be named. It's silly to have to do so, but welcome to internet censorship. Another thing I need to do is provide a summary of the first essay in the series. If you've not watched it yet, there's a link in the description below. In part 1, I examine the close ties between the evil ideologies of the 20th century and present a case for how they all sit on a bedrock of Marxism and anti-capitalism and collectivism. I show that the notions of hard left and hard right are largely meaningless when used to delineate ideologies such as communism, fascism, and the Nasty Party. They are all, in their founding principles and in their practices, very similar. Instead of hard left and hard right, I propose that we can better understand ideologies on 3 scales: authoritarian versus libertarian, free market versus state-controlled economy, and collectivism versus individualism. In the previous essay, I provided this comparison for liberal democracies and the Nasty Party, fascism, and Bolshevism, which is the variant of Marxism that won out in Russia. It's very apparent that the Nasty Party, fascism, and Bolshevism are actually closely tied together. Indeed, in the discussion in the essay, it's apparent that they share the same core of ideology, and each ideology is an adaptation of the same core to a particular context. Furthermore, over time, they tend to follow each other. For example, with all of the ideologies at some point or another adopting racism. In this essay, I take the comparison further. I look at wokeism and try to identify which elements of the Marxist evil ideologies wokeism most closely resembles. As you can see from the summary I'm showing, wokeism has elements that can be described as a pick and mix of previous evil ideologies. As you will note, wokeism does not match any previous ism. It does, however, quite heavily lean towards the Nasty Party in the respect that it shares so many basic commonalities. There may also be some surprises, like the very, very close match between wokeism and the Nasty Party on environmentalism. The purpose of the essay is to explain these comparisons, but before starting the comparison, it's vital to understand how wokeism has managed to become a powerful force in Western liberal democracies, and in particular in the countries of the Anglosphere. As most viewers will come from Anglosphere countries, the UK, the US, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, my focus will be on these countries. The comparison between wokeism and previous evil ideologies should be a worry, especially for the many people who've been deceived into believing wokeism is about justice, good, and right. Masses of people do not wake up one morning saying, "Today I'll do evil," but many will wake up in the morning saying, "I will do good today." History has shown us that when an ideology convinces people that evil deeds are for the good, people will do evil deeds. Wokeism is just the latest variant of just such an ideology. All of the evil ideologies of the 20th century proclaimed a moral mission, and I'll quote from Solzhenitsyn, a Soviet dissident who also did much to reveal the evils of the Soviet Union. To do evil, a human being must first of all believe that what he's doing is good. Ideology. That's what gives devil doing its long-sought justification and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination. That is the social theory which helps to make his acts seem good instead of bad, in his own eyes and others' eyes, so that he won't hear reproaches and curses, but will receive praise and honours. As I explain in the first essay, previous evil ideologies arose in a process of evolution, whereby the ideology that eventually won was an adaptation that was effective in the context of a particular country. Thus, Bolshevism was effective in Russia, the Nasty Party in Germany, and fascism in Italy. Therefore, in order to understand wokeism, it's necessary to see the ideology in the context of modern Western liberal democracies. Now, although wokeism has been evolving and adapting for a long time, at least from the 1970s, it only seemed to gain significant influence around about 2015. This is of course arguable, but it seems this is when it came to popular attention, albeit it was often seen as a university campus issue at that time. To start to set the context of the rise of wokeism, I'm going to start with economics. This is a bit dry, but it's a short section. Please stick with it, as there is an important point that comes out of it. In particular, economics is a traditional context given for the rise of revolutionary movements, for example in pre-revolutionary Russia. My question here is to ask whether economics might explain the rise of wokeism. In this video version, I'll keep the discussion brief. If you want more detail, see the essay on the markavis.org website, link below. A common measure of economic well-being is GDP growth, and the table I'm showing is taken from the OECD's statistics and shows GDP per capita. I provided for data for 1970 to give a big picture, 2015 as that's when wokeism became noticeable, and 2019 as the most recent data provided by the OECD. As can be seen, there's been ongoing GDP growth for all of the countries, and positive growth in GDP per capita is unlikely to be a foundation for a revolutionary movement. Another potential source of discontent might be individual income. As will be apparent, median incomes have been rising in recent years, albeit with some wobbles and dips for the UK and the US. So let's start with a chart from the UK. This is for the US. This is for New Zealand. And this chart is for Australia. And finally, this chart is for Canada. I've chosen a couple of basic statistics which give a very broad but simple overview of economic conditions in the selected countries, but there are many other statistics that might be added, more are examined in the essay, written essay, see link below. My aim is not to provide a cast iron case, but rather to give some numbers which will likely confirm what most people will be broadly experiencing within their own economic environment. The economic situation is not of a kind that would represent a significant driver towards revolutionary movements. For most people, most of the time, the economy is at least functioning reasonably, pandemic notwithstanding. Essentially, we all live in some of the most wealthy countries ever seen in human history, and it's thus difficult to argue that economic discontent provides an impetus for revolutionary radicalism. This is the first important contextual factor that's played a role in the development of the particular variant of Marxism that is wokeism. The economy is of little or no value for attracting a mass of people towards revolutionary change. I've bundled freedom and rights together, as they're overlapping for my purpose here. A useful metric for measuring freedom and rights is provided by the Cato Institute's Freedom Index. It includes measures such as freedom of religion, rights, and freedoms for minorities, including gender and sexuality. It therefore covers a very broad range of measures and includes measures that relate directly to the identity politics of wokeism. The index includes a country ranking, whereby a high-ranking country is seen as more free, with a total of 160 countries being ranked. Australia is ranked number 5, Canada is 6, New Zealand is in first place, and the UK and US tie at number 17. As such, all of the countries being considered are in the top 20 of the freest places, and even include, based on the index, the freest country in the world. As such, in addition to being economically stable and some of the most wealthy countries in world history, the selected countries are also notable for their very high levels of personal and economic freedom. Now, I should say this as an aside, all of this is notwithstanding the terrible loss of freedoms from hysterical responses to the pandemic. The rise of wokeism, though, predated the pandemic. To continue. Furthermore, this measure is taken at a point in time where rights have been steadily extended so that they now encompass the legal protection of individuals on the basis of sex, race and religion, and even sexual orientation. This is, in other words, a point in time where classical liberal values have been embedded in the legal structures of each of the societies we're considering. It's already possible to see that any new variant of Marxism needed to overcome two very serious challenges. The adaptation had to confront the serious headwinds of stable and wealthy economies alongside an unprecedented level of freedom and rights. What I've not discussed, though, is the poor reputation of Marxist thought in general. Marxism was closely associated with the failed Soviet Union, and the stories of the horrors of the Soviet Union were fully exposed with the collapse of the Soviet Union. For example, see the Black Book of Communism. The headwinds that lay in front of Marxists were indeed very strong. In fact, if looking at modern Western societies, it's difficult to imagine a less likely place for a variation of Marxism to take root. The closest historical comparison is Weimar Germany, but Weimar was subject to very significant economic strains and a general standard of living that was not comparable to modernity, albeit relatively high for the period. This leads to the question of how it was possible for wokeism to adapt so successfully to take root in such unpromising soil. The first point is vital. Marxists grasped that the working class had failed in following the historical role assigned to them by Marx. The last gasps of any significant working class radicalism were to die in or shortly after the 1970s. For example, Margaret Thatcher's defeat of the miners' strike. Even during the post-war period up until the 1970s, the radicalism of the working class was not sufficient to ever genuinely threaten liberal democracy. This was an uncomfortable reality for Marxists, and some kind of adaptation of Marxist thought was going to be necessary if the cause were to succeed. The answer was to be found in the replacement of the working class as the bulwark of revolutionary radicalism with the politics of identity, whereby marginalized groups, to use their jargon, could be radicalized into a new variant of Marxist ideology. The transition from a focus on classes to identity politics was not a natural transition. Traditional Marxist thinking rejected the use of ethnicity in their analysis, but there were already, nevertheless, undercurrents of interest in ethnicity, even in the 1960s. The revolutionary and anti-capitalist potential of identity politics was captured in a polemic from the Combahee River collective of black feminist women, which ends by expressing their own revolutionary potential and dedication to the revolutionary cause. Bearing in mind the potentially fertile ground of identity, in 1974, in Marxist academic circles, theorists were starting to make the transition from a class perspective to an identity perspective. This quote comes from Glaser in 1974. To be sure, most intellectuals still regard common economic circumstance, or class, as the principal political and social mode of the 20th century. One cannot deny that the spell of Marxism is still with us, but, as Nathan Glaser noted earlier, it is our contention that political reality around the globe is increasingly bound up with the resurgence of ethnicity. In all but a tiny handful of nations, ethnic, racial, and religious divisions have become the focus of profound political conflict. For too long, world affairs have been looked at from the viewpoint of Marxist economics or the traditional balance of power, with little attempt to understand the role of ethnic factors. Just a few years later, it was apparent that ethnicity was seen as an increasingly important factor in academic Marxist analysis. The direction of thought was clear. Whilst the working class had failed to heed the call for revolution, perhaps other collective identity groups might do better. Although the idea diverged from Marx, identity offered a potentially pragmatic solution to finding a potentially revolutionary group. However, it was not just ethnic identity that was to provide fruitful new ground. As with the Combahee River Collective, there was also a constituency to be found in extremist feminism and also in gay sexuality. The politics of identity may have had a core based on ethnicity, but was to develop into a coalition amongst a wide range of minorities. In this respect, the Combahee River Collective was a microcosm of what the movement was to be, both in terms of the nature of identity politics and the potential for radicalism. It was Marxism in a new form, with identity grievances acting as a Trojan horse for the introduction of other elements of Marxist thought. Whilst finding a potential source of anger and disaffection to harness, identity politics was never going to deliver the mass necessary for revolutionary change. The period of the 1960s onwards also saw a significant advance in equalization of rights for each of the identity groups, with reform of legal codes and the initiation of rights-based legislation. This is not to say that everything transformed overnight for minority groups. It's beyond the scope of this essay to examine the claims of wokeism and the rebuttals of those claims, so I'll instead just propose that there's been significant debate over how far the reforms achieved their goals. What is certain is that if the coalition that were formed under the banner of wokeism were to survive, it was necessary to continue to emphasize the grievances of the minority groups. Nevertheless, even if succeeding in holding the coalition of the aggrieved together, this was never going to be sufficient to create a mass for a revolutionary change. Identity groups might be enough to sustain Marxism, but were not enough to nurture Marxism to a revolutionary force. The solution to this problem came with the massive expansion of higher education, which saw an ever higher proportion of young people attending universities. For example, in my home country of New Zealand, the percentage of the population holding a bachelor's degree or higher has jumped from 13% in 2001 to 35% in 2020. Similar expansions can be found for all of the countries of interest here. However, it's not just the expansion in university education that was the solution. It was the expansion and the changing shape of the faculty that was key to the change. In contrast to wider society, the university still had a large number of die-hard Marxists, as well as a majority of faculty who at least leaned towards socialism. The proportion of those who are on the extreme has only been increasing over time. The figure here is from the Washington Post and captures the shift in faculty leanings. Similar data to the US can be found for the countries of interest for this discussion, including examples where the socialist Marxist bias is even stronger. The problem of the overall bias towards socialism in the universities is still not even the whole picture. There's a raft of disciplines in which moderates, and here I include, for example, the centre-left, are now on the verge of extinction, and this covers many of the social sciences and humanities, which also happen to be the disciplines that most benefited from student numbers growth. It was not just the numbers game still that made the changing shape of the universities important, but also a really substantive qualitative change. This was the growth in angry, aggressive, and intolerant activism. Ground zero of the aggression and intolerance are what have been described as grievance studies, disciplines promoting wokeism, such as gender studies and black studies. To a large degree, grievance studies were a springboard which was to launch wokeism into the broader social sciences and humanities. The result has been a substantive change on campuses that are now so intolerant that moderates and conservatives have formed an international organisation called the Heterodox Academy to defend tolerance and viewpoint diversity on campuses. Having conquered most of the university, wokeism is now starting to conquer the natural sciences. This is a quote from Ario magazine. Most of the scientists who see the writing on the wall and wish they could do something about it will eagerly tell you precisely why they don't speak and act against the creeping woke hegemony they know will eventually corrupt their disciplines, possibly for generations. They're afraid. They're afraid they'll all be fired. They're afraid they'll all be blacklisted from jobs, tenure, and research funding opportunities. They're afraid there'll be thorns in the side of the administration, especially the grand wizards of their institutions' offices of diversity and inclusion, and targets of the newly minted campus inquisition bias response teams, and never have another peaceful day to get real work done. The result's what's apparent today, which is that the universities are increasingly foregoing their classical liberal mission. This has led to what's been described as a choice between being a social justice, or wokeism university, or a knowledge university, i.e. classical liberalism. It's apparent that the former is winning out against the latter. The result of this change in the university system is that they are now less and less serve as educational organisations and more like indoctrination factories. Wokeism is therefore spreading through the educated young, many of whom are becoming activists or at least sympathetic to wokeism. Worryingly, it appears that many of these young people who are sympathetic to wokeism do not even seem to understand wokeism beyond its most superficial platitudes about fairness and justice, i.e., they do not see or understand that they're part of a revolutionary movement. As a result of this, a large number of young people are either fully endorsing wokeism or willing to give tacit support to the cause. In addition to pumping out postgraduates who are to take over the other disciplines, grievance studies have long been pumping out ever more radicalized graduates. These graduates, aggressive and intolerant of any dissent from their views, have percolated through society. They've been particularly effective in capturing NGOs to the cause of wokeism, but have also been successful in cultural institutions and the government. However, they were initially constrained by a lack of mass support. That has changed. The capture of the universities by wokeism has changed this, with waves and waves of new graduates entering into employment who've been indoctrinated into wokeism. Thus, we see so many institutions falling to wokeism, much to the dismay of genuine liberals and conservatives everywhere. The fall of institutions from liberalism to wokeism is perhaps best captured in the resignation of Bari Weiss from the New York Times. She was pushed out as a result of a new generation of aggressive woke individuals attacking her for her views. The curiosity of this situation is that it's the middle classes, in the British sense of the word, who appear to be the bedrock of wokeism. This was captured in the Hidden Tribes study in the US. The majority of progressives, in speech marks, were white, wealthy, and well-educated. I use the term educated loosely, as many, of course, are not educated in any meaningful sense of the word. Wokeism is therefore an ideology of the elites in society, and it's no coincidence that the most prestigious universities appeared to be the earliest to succumb to wokeism. As such, wokeism is now constructed from a minority of radicalized individuals from minority groups, a mass of middle-class graduates, and an elite of graduates and postgraduates from the most prestigious universities. In other words, wokeism could not be further from a working-class movement. I should declare at the start of this section that I've been an atheist since I was 9 years old and remain one today. I never viewed religion in a very positive light, but that view has started to shift in recent years. One reason for the change is that it's becoming apparent that human psychology seems to have evolved in a way that requires or seeks something like a religious belief system. Another reason is that it seems that moderate religions such as traditional Anglicanism are preferable to what could be seen to be replacing them. Over each of the countries of interest, there's been a very dramatic decline in Christianity. The result of this decline in traditional organized religion has been to leave a vacuum, and that vacuum is being filled with either wokeism or a vaguely determined New Age paganism. And this new paganist direction connects tightly with the ideas of wokeism. However, the most significant connection between wokeism and modern paganism has been what Barrett describes as carbon Calvinism. Barrett observes how environmentalism has grown into a religious movement, and one that's filled the hole that was left by traditional religions, in particular for the urban middle class. Barrett makes his case by noting how closely environmentalism maps to the structure of traditional religions, and even how traditional Christian ideas have appeared in revised form in environmentalism, for example, medieval indulgences versus carbon offsets. One interesting point in his discussion is the story of how Lovelock's Gaia thesis, the Earth seen as a singular organism, has been taken as literal and has become part of a pagan belief system rather than the metaphor it was intended to be. This example captures the tension between science and those who've adopted environmentalism as a new religion, and as Garrow observes, this now constitutes an element of the wider culture wars. Indeed, the rise of wokeism has always been tightly linked with the religiosity of environmentalism, and this is an important feature that supported the rise of wokeism itself. A key facet of the environmentalist religion is anti-capitalism, and this is captured in a Guardian article with a headline saying, "Ending climate change requires the end of capitalism. Have we got the stomach for it?" The subheading goes on to say the following: "Policy tweaks won't do it. We need to throw the kitchen sink at this, with a total rethink of our relationship to ownership, work, and capital." The more radical fringes of the environmentalist movement echo the same sentiments, and this is reflected in the discourse of the Green Anti-Capitalist Front. In addition to advocating for direct action for environmental causes, it's no surprise to find the following on the website. "We are against all forms of exploitation and oppression, including but not limited to those based on class, race, sex, sexuality, gender, or ability, and we support trans and sex worker inclusive feminism." The connection between environmentalism and wokeism is not limited to a few cranks on the margin or Guardian columnists, but can be found at the heart of mainstream politics. As just one example, the US Congresswoman AOC proposed a Green New Deal that tightly meshed environmentalism and the identity politics of wokeism. Environmentalism, and particularly religious environmentalism, has become a Trojan horse to allow anti-capitalist thinking to enter into middle-class discourse. It is one of the more powerful adaptations of wokeism, as it provides a means of attacking capitalism in a way that is palatable to the middle classes, the very people who've benefited from the wealth that capitalism has given them. For the purpose of this essay, it was necessary to give a broad brush overview of the context that shaped wokeism. I hope that at least it's sufficient discussion to give us some sense of the how and why of the Marxist adaptation that is wokeism. The explanation thus far does leave out, though, the powerful influences that were to shape wokeism within the universities, the arrival of postmodernism, and the work of the Marxist Frankfurt School. These deserve closer attention than I can give here. Instead, I've focused on some particular contexts which created significant challenges for the success of Marxist-derived ideologies, unprecedented wealth, freedoms, and a strong and strengthening culture of human rights. The working class was failing to live up to Marxist expectations, for the simple reason that capitalism was largely delivering on its promises and life was good and improving. In this context, there were two key changes in society that offered new ways to revive Marxism. The first was to refocus attention away from the working class and towards other identity groups. These would provide the core of a new Marxist movement, a vanguard if you like. Alongside this, the massive expansion of university education coincided with an aggressive takeover of much of the university sector by wokeism ideology. Add in the falling away of traditional religion and a growing and increasingly religious environmental movement, it allowed for capitalist discourse to become acceptable even amongst the middle classes. Wokeism thus became an adaptation of Marxism that might flourish in what would otherwise have been barren ground. In the section that follows, I'll show that there is nothing that is wholly new in this Marxist adaptation that is wokeism, albeit it has a logic that's created some odd outcomes. One of the most striking aspects of wokeism is the relentless focus on race and racism. Of course, this reflects the origin of wokeism in identity politics in the 1970s. This in turn has given wokeism one of its most bizarre features, which is the growth of anti-white racism, whereby followers of wokeism will use anti-white racist rhetoric even though directed at themselves. This aspect of wokeism has been the source of much puzzlement, but in the context of wokeism's foundation starts to make an odd kind of sense. By necessity, those who adhere to wokeism must support the idea of grievance for minorities, or the structure of the key foundation of wokeism would collapse. In particular, wokeism replaced the working class as being oppressed by a capitalist class with the notion of minorities being oppressed by a capitalist system run and built by a white, heterosexual male majority. These were the new class of oppressors. Disturbingly, the focus on race has seen the emergence of a structure of belief that mirrors that of the Nasty Party. The most obvious connection has been the rise of anti-Semitism on the so-called left of politics. This can be seen most vividly in the Labour Party in the UK, but is also appearing in US politics from the very woke Ilhan Omar, a congresswoman. Further, the anti-white racism, whilst an oddity, is increasingly mirroring Nasty Party views of the Jews. In particular, the rhetoric of institutional racism, white privilege, and so forth mirrors the idea of the Nasty Party that the Jews were a hidden force behind all of the problems of society. In place of the Jews, white people are painted in wokeism as sinister, filled with racism, continually working to oppress minorities, and responsible for all of the ills of society, both past and present. And the current world is founded upon these evil and sinister people who exercise power through systems and institutions that have the purpose of maintaining white supremacy. It's an entirely deranged conspiracy theory, and it's so similar to the ravings of Voldemort that it's quite startling. For example, when reading sections of his book, Mein Kampf, A Tedious Task, this is the same kind of raving conspiracy theory that Voldemort applied to the Jews. Whilst the conspiracy theory is bad enough, the discourse of anti-white racism and wokeism is starting to use genocidal language and metaphors. I've written about 2 recent incidents on the markavis.org website of high-profile psychoanalysts using genocidal language applied to white people. This is a quote from one of the authors. Whiteness is a condition one first acquires, and then one has a malignant, parasitic-like condition to which white people have a particular susceptibility. The condition is foundational, generating characteristic ways of being in one's body, in one's mind, and in one's world. Parasitic whiteness renders its hosts of appetites voracious, insatiable, and perverse. These deformed appetites particularly target non-white peoples. Once established, these appetites are nearly impossible to eliminate. The speed of the transition from the racist notions such as white privilege to outright genocidal language is both startling and shocking. The increasing racialization of society, the attacks on Jews and white people, is not just similar to the Nasty Party, it is a replay of the racist thinking of the Nasty Party. Further, just as the Nasty Party sought to embed their racist doctrines in school, we can see the same thing, the same process playing out today with the introduction of critical race theory in schools. Up until recently, there's been a fundamental problem in the way that wokeism was understood. Wokeism portrayed itself as anti-racist, and the attacks on white people were discombobulating. Racism in Western countries had been so closely associated with white racism towards minorities, it was hard for people to process the idea that it was possible for racism to flow in the other direction, towards white people. Furthermore, the fact that white people were using racist rhetoric against themselves was even more bizarre. This has created a long period of confusion, and it's only recently that wokeism has begun to be seen for what it is, a fundamentally racist ideology. This change of thinking is captured by the UK intellectual Douglas Murray, who now clearly describes wokeism as a racist movement. Another defining feature of wokeism has been the desire to tear down much of the past, whether it's books, statues, street names, etc. This exactly mirrors the Cultural Revolution in China, which saw a sustained attack on what was described as the Four Olds, which were old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. The process of the Chinese Cultural Revolution was a vicious process of violent upheaval that came close to full civil war in China. Mao started to lose control. Mao's purpose for attacking the Four Olds was to entirely unmoor the Chinese people from the past, so that they would more readily and devotedly adopt his own variant of Marxism. The same goal is being pursued by the woke, and this is most apparent in the movement to decolonize the curriculum in universities. This means the removal of dead white men from the curriculum, which would notably also include removing most of the philosophy of classical liberalism and the intellectual history of the Western world. Alongside the destruction of the olds, the aim is to replace the old thinking with a new revisionist past, whereby wokeism is embedded in all. The 1619 Project is an obvious example of this, as the project seeks to reconstruct US history based upon wokeism ideology. Within liberal democracies, there are still constraints on this attempt at cultural revolution, but the potential for violence is always there, for example with the violence surrounding the toppling of statues. Given the history of the Cultural Revolution, should be no surprise that Chinese people who fled the Cultural Revolution are speaking out against wokeism.
I've been very alarmed about what's going on in our school. You are now training our children to be social justice warriors and to loathe our country and our history. Growing up in Mao's China, all this seemed very familiar. The communist regime used the same critical theory to divide people. The only difference is they use class instead of race. During the Cultural Revolution, I witnessed students and teachers turn against each other. We changed school names to be politically correct. We were taught to denounce our heritage. The Red Guards destroy anything that is not communist, old statues, books, and anything else. We are also encouraged to report on each other, just like the Student Equity Ambassador Program and the bias reporting system. This is indeed the American version of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. The critical race theory has its roots in cultural Marxism. It should have no place in our schools.
One of the striking aspects of wokeism is that it is widely supported by the intellectual and cultural elites, in particular in the universities. This was true of socialism in pre-revolutionary Russia, but this was a context where the country was run by an autocrat. A better comparison is with Germany, which had been a liberal democracy during the days of the Weimar Republic and where the university system was seen as the best in the world, comparable to the US today. At this time, university education was still limited to a tiny proportion of the population, far, far fewer people than today. Despite this, the leading ranks of the Nasty Party were stuffed, not only with university graduates, but also PhD graduates. This was particularly true for the SS and Einsatzgruppen, the most murderous elements of the Nasty Party regime. Aside from Jewish and leftist academics, university faculty were either supportive of the Nasty Party or willing to accommodate them. This, for example, is research examining the Nasty Party and academic history in the German universities. Above all, it's my contentions that attempts to salvage true research from a regrettable but only superficial involvement with the Nasty Party regime are flawed. Historians and their work were not simply abused by the regime. Historians were not simply naive and mistaken about the true character of the regime. On the contrary, historians at German universities actively and voluntarily helped legitimize Germany's claim to European hegemony. Furthermore, the directions of historical research and the interpretation of its results were to an extraordinary extent influenced by the new paradigms of the time. A more general picture of collaboration is painted by the historian Noakes. The title of this article was chosen to indicate the beleaguered state of the German universities in the Third Reich, under pressure to conform to the ideology and goals of the Nasty Party regime. However, an equally appropriate title might have been Treason in the Ivory Tower, a trahison des clercs, in Julian Bender's phrase. For arguably the most striking feature of the history of the universities in the Third Reich is the relative ease with which they adapted themselves to the new order. Indeed, many German academics, for a time at least, actually welcomed and eagerly cooperated with a movement and a regime that was blatantly at odds with the traditional values of their profession. This is from Victor Klemperer, dismissed from his university for his Jewish ancestry, discussing the collaboration of academics with the Nasty Party. If one day the fate of the vanquished lay in my hands, then I would let all the ordinary folk go, and even some of the leaders, who might, after all, have had honourable intentions, but I would have the intellectuals strung up, and the professors 3 feet higher than the rest. They would be left hanging from lampposts, as long as was compatible with hygiene. These are strong words from Klemperer, but unsurprising given his suffering under the Nasty Party. In all the accounts of the academics under the Nasty Party, collaboration is due to an ideological commitment to the cause, careerism, or an unwillingness to speak out. The same is true of the universities and wokeism now. Many of the faculty positively welcome wokeism, and those that do not largely remain silent. After all, it's not good for your career to oppose wokeism. This is one of the most difficult comparisons to pin down, as wokeism is still an emerging power in liberal democracies, and followers are still facing limits to action from liberal democratic norms. There are also differences depending on what's focused on. For example, if looking at activist organisations like Black Lives Matter, they openly profess their anti-capitalist stance. However, if looking at followers of wokeism in mainstream politics, the ideas tend to look more like the corporatism of the early days of fascist Italy or Nasty Party Germany. We will leave you alone, but only provided you endorse and support wokeism, always with a threat there. For sure, anti-capitalism is part of the ideology, and it seems that how far any individual will go on the topic is a question of political strategy. As discussed in the first essay, the nature of what might replace the current capitalist system is left opaque, and this is a feature, not a bug of the ideology. Pure anti-capitalism at this stage would potentially frighten away too many supporters. Thus, the Green New Deal can be seen as corporatist and anti-capitalism light, as can the growing alliance between big business and wokeism. Of course, all the evil ideologies mirrored each other's economic policies at one time or another. My guess is that if wokeism ideology gains full authoritarian power, wokeism will look like the corporatism in the early days of fascism, but will become more traditionally Marxist with time, something like the Stalinist system. It is in some respects inevitable, but that is a discussion for another time. For this section, I'll rely heavily on the historical analysis of Staudenmeier, and the section will be very quote-heavy. This is the first quote. Weimar culture, after all, was fairly awash in such theories, but the Nasty Party gave them a peculiar inflection. The National Socialist religion of nature, as one historian has described it, was a volatile admixture of primeval Teutonic nature mysticism, pseudo-scientific ecology, irrationalist anti-humanism, and a mythology of racial salvation through a return to the land. Its predominant themes were natural order, organicist holism, and denigration of humanity. Throughout the writings, not only of Voldemort, but of most of the Nasty Party ideologues, one could discern a fundamental deprecation of humans vis-à-vis nature, and as a logical corollary to this, an attack upon human efforts to master nature. This conceptual constellation, especially the search for a lost connection to nature, was most pronounced amongst the neo-pagan elements in the Nasty Party leadership. Above all, Heinrich Himmler, Alfred Rosenberg, and Walter Darré. Rosenberg wrote in his colossal The Myth of the 20th Century, "Today we see the steady stream from the countryside to the city, deadly for the Volk. The cities, swell ever larger, unnerving the Volk, and destroying the threads which bind humanity to nature. They attract adventurers and profiteers of all colours, thereby fostering racial chaos." And later, such musings, it must be stressed, were not mere rhetoric. They reflected firmly held beliefs, and indeed practices at the very top of the Nasty Party hierarchy, which are today conventionally associated with ecological attitudes. Voldemort and Himmler were both strict vegetarians and animal lovers, attracted to nature mysticism and homeopathic cures, and staunchly opposed to vivisection and cruelty to animals. Himmler even established experimental organic farms to grow herbs for SS medicinal purposes, and Voldemort at times could sound like a veritable green utopian, discussing authoritatively and in detail various renewable energy sources, including environmentally appropriate hydropower and producing natural gas from sludge. as alternatives to coal and declaring water, winds and tides the energy path of the future. I think I need to add nothing more to the quotes above, except to say there's considerable detail in the discussion that makes the comparison with modern environmentalism very, very compelling. Of course, the history is largely unknown to most people, albeit in the academic literature there's fierce debate over the nature of the green elements in the nasty party. And there's a considerable amount of pushback, even though the facts are the facts. There is no doubt that the nasty party was indeed a very, very environmentally, very green focused party. I discussed the new man concept in the first essay, so we'll only touch on it very briefly now. See the link below for more detail. The essence of the idea was to shape the population into a new collective form, which would act as an ideologically defined improvement of humanity. As part of the nasty party ideology, the state promoted healthy and positive behaviours as they saw it, with propaganda and policy, with academia providing the foundations for the campaign. The Soviet Union did the same. The topics are exactly the same ones that we see today encompassed under, for example, social marketing and public health policies. For example, promoting eating brown rather than white bread. It does not take much to see that wokeism is not alone in this, but also that wokeism is particularly positive about using the state to create a new man, albeit they do not use the term new man. God forbid that they would use such a gendered term. We can see where the logic leads in the leading academic journal for marketing, the Journal of Marketing, in which the author considers using carrots, sticks and promises to enforce eugenic sterilization, i.e. one option is to use the state power to forcibly genetically test, then punish harshly anyone who does not comply with sterilization. To date, I've seen no criticism of this article, and it was later republished in a book on ethics and social marketing. The academic world, it seems, is comfortable with these ideas. But then again, in the nasty party Germany, it seems academics were comfortable with many of the ideas that came from that party. I discussed street thugs in Germany in my previous video essay. The thugs fighting on the streets were nasty party members and Bolsheviks. In the case of the Bolsheviks, they named themselves Antifa, short for anti-fascists. Of course, the same Antifa movement has popped up all over the Western world and uses the same violent tactics in the name of anti-fascism. Notably today, nearly all of the violence is taking place in absence of any fascists and often involves violence against people and businesses that have no plausible relationship with any extremist ideology. Of course, as I've pointed out, where there are any fascists, the fight is with just a competing adaptation of Marxist ideology. The goal of the violence is clear. It's there to intimidate the population, create a sense of crisis in the general population, and intimidate anyone who dares push back against wokeism. I've looked at some of the most evil ideologies from the 20th century and sought how these compare with wokeism. If we think of the context in which wokeism emerged, it's far closer to Weimar Germany than pre-revolutionary China or Russia. In particular, Germany was an advanced economy with high levels of education, liberal democracy, rights and freedoms, but also with an economy that went through a series of crises. As such, it's not surprising to see that the pick and mix from previous evil ideologies seems to find the closest analogy with the nasty party. However, that's not the whole story. For example, wokeism diverges sharply from other variants of Marxism, all variants, in some limited areas, such as the support for gay sexuality and transgenderism. The Soviet Union, for example, was similarly intolerant of what they described as deviance. However, the inclusion of these in the wokeism ideology are just following the logic of identity politics, the assembling of a coalition of the aggrieved. There are also other elements that are from what was be more traditionally viewed as Marxist ideology, such as the oppressor-oppressed notion of collectivism, internationalism, and the use of cultural revolution strategies. Also, it's apparent that wokeism is not yet a unified ideology, but is instead split over different actors, from mainstream politicians to street thugs. Furthermore, unlike previous adaptations of evil ideologies, we're yet to see a leader who's powerful enough to enforce any kind of unity on the varied groups following the ideology. This final point raises a great concern. How long until such a leader emerges? It's a quite terrifying question. At the very end of this discussion, though, I'd like to end with a reminder that those who've fallen for the ideology of wokeism are not inherently evil, or mostly not. It is the nature of evil ideology that advocates for the ideology fool people into believing they're on the side of the good. This does not remove all responsibility from the woke, but it should also temper our response to those who follow the ideology.